What's the best example of FU money you've seen? Story 1. Kerry Packer. He frequented a particular casino often. One night after a good run, he wanted to tip the dealer. She declined as per casino policy, so he asked to see her supervisor, who affirmed that it was against company policy for employees to accept tips from clientele. He demanded that they fire her, or he'd never come back. They obliged. He then said, "Well, now she's not an employee, I can tip her," and gave her a ridiculous sum of money. The supervisor obliged. Kerry then said, "Hire her back again, or I'll never come back to your casino." She got her job back and pocketed the tip. Story 2. I'm an employment and contract attorney. In my younger days, I was corp counsel for a large hospital. We were in the midst of a fundraising campaign and were a few million from our goal. Got a call from a wealthy, youngish guy. Offered to cover the remainder plus 10% with 2 stipulations. He used to work at the hospital when he was younger and made it rich with a medical device company he started. So he wanted a voting member board seat, and he wanted to fire this vice president, who was his supervisor when he worked there and had made his life miserable. He was the reason he quit and eventually into business for himself. Took it to the board and CEO. They agreed to the board seat. I couldn't advise. They allowed the firing for liability purposes. However, the CEO decided to reorganize certain departments, and coincidentally, this VP's position was eliminated. The new board member chaired the committee that made the call on the reorganization and informed the VP of the changes. That was the biggest FU, long-term grudge I ever saw. Story 3. This is from my own personal experience. My wife is a doctor and was in a successful practice with another doctor for 25 years. For that entire time, my wife was on top of the finances in the business, making sure insurance reimbursements were correct, negotiating insurance contracts, getting deals on vaccines, and dealing with the employees. Her partner knew nothing about that stuff and just let her handle it all. A few years ago, he brought his wife into work in the office over my wife's objections. The wife would do shady stuff like take patients off my wife's schedule and put them on her husband's schedule, which impacted my wife's income. After COVID, my wife was just done with it all, and I told her we had FU money if she wanted to leave. She told her partner she was leaving at the end of the year, gave him a month's notice, and said she would help him with the insurance reimbursements and everything until he got the hang of it. He told her no, not to come back at all, that he would handle it and didn't need her help. 7 months later, the practice closed down because he was incompetent. He turned a practice that made 7 figures a year into dust in just a few months. I love that story. Story 4. I worked at a high-end eco-resort some time ago. We spent weeks preparing for some guests who booked up half the resort for him and his family. Doing a bunch of renovations and changes in the cabins and rooms because the guy was very picky, but he was spending a lot, so whatever. We even rebuilt the motor on another boat and outfitted it for downrigging because they needed 3 fishing boats. The guy shows up for his reservation, and the first thing he does is start cussing out and belittling the girl at the front desk. The owner walked in to see what his problem was, and the guy proceeded to dump on the front desk girl to him. So the owner just said, "I'm terribly sorry you feel that way. We will give you a full return on your deposit so you can find somewhere better to stay." The guy's face was white, and he starts apologizing and pleading with him, but the owner didn't care. The guy had to go out to the parking lot and explain to his entire family how his garbage temper messed up their 1-week vacation, and they'd have to find somewhere else to stay. The owner couldn't give a thing how much extra money he had spent. He wasn't taking that dump, and more importantly, he wasn't going to make the staff take that shift. He wasn't my favorite boss, but that is something I respect. Story 5. Guy I used to work for thought it would be funny to hire a limo to take a friend to lunch. The restaurant was literally next door to where they were. Limo company refused to rent by the hour and said he had to rent it for the entire day. Guy was angry, so just bought a limo. After lunch he was still angry and decided to just buy a few more and start his own limo company. Month or 2 later, he bought the company that refused him an hourly rental. Story 6. Ferruccio Lamborghini. Back in the days, he got rich building tractors, and he bought himself a Ferrari because he's Italian, and it was the thing to do when you became successful. Unfortunately, sports car clutches back then were crap and failed often. He went to Ferrari himself and said he could fix the problem, and was told to go back to his tractors because he knew nothing about high-performance cars. The wiki says he made cars to compete with Ferrari and the others, but in reality, he did it to spite Ferrari. Starting a car factory to spite someone, epic level of FU. Story 7. This is more of a you should reconsider rather than a proper FU. Growing up, our neighbor was incredibly wealthy, probably in the low nine figures, owned a tremendous amount of land, and could probably influence the price of beef with the amount of cattle he had and oil, of course. He was in his 80s, health was deteriorating, so his kids showed up while he was recovering from surgery and explained to him they didn't want him driving anymore and took his truck. Soon as they left, he called a local dealership and had a brand new truck dropped off an hour later. Kids came back over the next day, and he just told them he decided he wanted to keep driving and was fine buying another new truck every day if he had to. Story 8. My friend's mother-in-law has a wonderful home on Cape Cod. It's not one of the huge McMansion eyesores that started showing up in nearby towns in the 1980s. It's just a very comfortable, well-designed, 3-bed, 2-bath house on a hillside with lots of beautiful hand-hewn woodwork and an incredible view of the coast just a couple streets downhill. The house was built in the mid-1950s, and while there aren't many strict legal boundaries regarding what can and cannot be built, renovated, expanded, or demolished, the folks in this community have been happily coexisting so well for the past 75-plus years that you can count the number of incidents on one hand, and everyone knows who tried to do what with their house or their land. The neighbor who lived one street downhill, between my pal's mother-in-law and the coast, sadly passed away during the COVID pandemic, and because his children had moved away, the property went to market and was immediately snatched up well over asking price by some Boston-based tech bro. Within a month, he'd started demolishing the retaining walls and driveway to allow access for the general contractor he hired to tear down the existing house, which had been meticulously cared for and looked right at home in the neighborhood, and raise a new concrete and blast monstrosity that would have completely severed the line of sight to the coast for at least 4 houses located uphill. I wasn't aware of the means available to my buddy's mother-in-law, but after a few neighbors introduced themselves to this new arrival to the area and expressed their concerns, she cut him a check for 5% above what he paid for the house. No loans, no remortgage on her existing home, no payment plan, just bought it outright for more than I'll earn in the next 25 years, even if I'm lucky. The downhill house is now rented well below market value to a lovely family with 2 kids. Story 9. Billionaire Howard Hughes reserved the top 2 floors of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas for 10 days. When his 10 days were up, the hotel asked him to check out. He wasn't ready to leave, so he bought the hotel and stayed there for 4 years. Story 10. This story's lore grows with every retelling, but it's one of my favorites from growing up. There was a restaurant outside my small town. A billionaire was eating there without showing his status whatsoever at all. He asked for fries on the side of his meal instead of mashed potatoes. The waitress made a big deal about how the place didn't do substitutions. He politely pointed out that they had French fries on their menu, so he wasn't sure what the issue was. She reiterated that mashed potatoes was the assigned side for his meal and they wouldn't switch it. He escalated to a manager who said fries were no problem. That probably would have been the end of it, but the waitress wouldn't let it go, haranguing him throughout the meal, doing the thing where you talk loudly about someone within earshot of them, really talking to them. Just generally being obnoxious for no reason, making a big deal of nothing. So he quietly bought the restaurant for twice what it was worth, allowing the owners to retire early, and fired this woman. Story 11. A former boss of mine was going through a contentious divorce. Her husband had skipped town down to Florida with some skank, ditching my boss and their son. Eventually, when the divorce was being finalized, it came to the point where they had to divide assets. She was the primary breadwinner, and the judge ruled that she had to either give him one of her vehicles. She had several large trucks, or buy him a new one. Her husband was no small freak. He stood 6'7", and was a former bodybuilder. So rather than give her one of her many trucks, she bought him a completely brand new Toyota Prius. This huge man looked like he was driving a clown car around town, and it was hilarious. Story 12. Kerry Packer playing poker in Las Vegas when a Texan approached the table and was being a nuisance. The Texan was asked to calm down and responded with, "Don't you know who I am? I am worth $100 million, you know." Packer apparently interjected with, "I'll flip you for it." Kerry Packer was worth $4 billion on his death. His life story is a fascinating tale. Story 13. My ex worked at a very expensive, very private golf course. One day a few members are playing poker in the lounge for $5.10 a hand, and walks this hotshot new member who asks to play. When he hears what they're playing for, he says something along the lines of, "What's the point of that? We're all rich. Let's play for real money." Nobody's really interested in this. They just want to play for fun, but the guy won't drop it. Finally, the oldest of the group says, "Okay, let's play. What's your net worth?" To which the younger guy smugly replies, $2 million. The older guy goes, "All right, let's play the next hand for $2 million, straight up." The younger guy gets all huffy, saying he just wanted to have fun. Why is the old guy being such a fool? Old guy responds, "I'm worth $30 million. But I don't need to be a bum to prove it. Now shut up and play or get the hell out." The younger guy did not want to play, apparently canceled his membership a week later. Story 14. A guy in my Friday evening badminton group in Singapore told us that he was relocating to Hong Kong. We knew that he ran a tech business, and he told us that he was starting a new business in Hong Kong. A few months after his move to Hong Kong, he started showing up for our badminton games every fortnight. He'd fly from Hong Kong to Singapore on Friday afternoons on a chartered private jet, take the subway from the airport to our badminton game. After the game, he'd join us for a street food meal, and then fly back to Hong Kong that same night. It turns out that his tech business in Singapore had been acquired by a large Silicon Valley company for a modest 9-figure sum, and he really missed Singapore's street food. Story 15. I worked at a cigar lounge in South Florida and have some wild stories. Here is the wildest. I had clocked out for the day and sat down to smoke a cigar. At the table was a very successful board member of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the U.S. This guy is seriously, insanely loaded. Talking to him about his kids, and he mentions he has a daughter. I'm being cordial and ask something like, "Oh, what does she do for work?" He makes a face and says that she doesn't work. I felt like a fool for asking. He was on to say that she really loves astronomy and space. It's her hobby. Then proceeds to say that he called Richard earlier that day to have him add his daughter to a private trip up there. It took me a second to realize that the Richard he was talking about was Richard Branson. Up there was freaking space. He just casually called Richard Branson on a Tuesday morning to get his daughter a trip into space, because astronomy was a hobby of hers. That's some money if I've ever seen it. Story 16. I've had interactions with a few billionaires when I was working with a charity that became quite trendy around a decade ago. I will respect their anonymity, but I don't think you'd have heard of any of them unless you are an avid reader of rich lists. We're not talking about the Musks or Zuckerbergs of this world, but usually second or third generation wealth with significant interests in a family office. The craziest display of FU money I think eyewitnesses was a Rembrandt etching, which I assumed to be original, hanging in a bathroom. Another guy lost 2 jets in a hangar fire. Rather than wait for insurance, he casually spent another $40 million on a replacement jet to tide him over, until the insurance was resolved. I realized that this isn't crazy behavior, because he was almost certainly going to be made whole via a claim, but to not think twice about spending tens of millions of dollars was the first time I encountered true FU money. Story 17. I work for a family-owned haulage firm. The owner buys 5 brand-new trucks a year as a tax write-off. We're talking $250,000 each worth of Scania, and dishes them out to the longer-serving drivers. Newbies get their hand-me-downs. One year, everyone was satisfied with the trucks they already had, so he just parked over $1 million worth of trucks lined up in a row near the front gate, just as a showpiece for anyone driving past. Story 18. This regular in a restaurant I worked at bought his neighbor's villa because he didn't like the people that came to have a house viewing. Same guy had a Hummer, one with a bulletproof privacy screen he'd put up when he'd pick up his mother-in-law, so he'd have some quiet on the drive home. He tipped us generously, so after a particularly bad shift, he gave one of the waitresses a 5,000 ring right of his fingers. Dude was a certified baller. Story 19. I knew a guy would come into a coffee shop I worked at. He'd always drive his Ferrari and get a cup of black coffee and 2 scoops of chocolate gelato. One time he asked me if I wanted to go shooting at a range up the road. Really beautiful range, kind of famous. Obviously, I obliged, and so we left Monday morning, before one of my shifts. On the way he told me that the range used to be closed on Mondays. However, he was entertaining some people from out of the country who he wanted to do business with, and they really wanted to go shooting at this range, but they could only meet on a Monday, so he bought the range. Story 20. Client that just had a truck get a bunch of rust repair, bodywork, and was painted at our shop. He dropped nearly $8,000 on bodywork and paint to restore a 70s Ford for fleet service, because he wanted a truck identical to one his dad drove in the 70s. He started and built a very successful kitchen and bath refinishing and supply company. Sold it for a huge profit, but after a few years, didn't like the way the new owners were handling the business and sullying his reputation with his client base. A few years later, he used some of the money from the sale and started a new kitchen and bath refinishing and supply company across the street. Ran his old business/competitor down so much they sold everything back to him for pennies on the dollar. Now he's got a massive showroom across the street from a massive warehouse and is the biggest king in town. That's a wrap for this video. Make sure to leave your relatable story down in the comments. I would love to make a video on them. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.